In lecture 2, we're going to just kind of introduce the idea of, the background and why we study human behavior and the origins that we believe current day human behavior evolved out of. And as psychologists, this is really important because if we want to understand human behavior today, we have to have an understanding of how it might have been, so how it's evolved, and then what are current models in which we could actually manipulate behavior in other animals to mirror or gather understanding of our own human behavior. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about this and why most physiological psych or biopsych courses start off with this kind of discussion, because it provides a really good framework for us to understand basically the remainder of the course. Why do we do this? And primarily, it's, as I mentioned, the brain behavior is really complex. Human behavior is very hard to explain, and whenever we see abnormal behaviors, we can point them out, but we don't always understand why they're occurring. And one of the things about mental health is that we often, as a society, we don't deal with it well. And we put it in this box of very abnormal behaviors and that we don't understand it. And part of it's because the brain is so complex. From our perspective, we do believe it is the most complex organ on earth, the human brain, because of all the interactions between neurons and then how those actually interact with the rest of the body. So we have an opportunity to use what we see in animal models to help us understand what might be happening in our own bodies and our own brains. One of our major problems is that we don't have a good way to understand how the brain functions. Right now, our best technology can capture activity in the brain at about 3 seconds. So every 3 seconds, it's taking a reading of what's happening in the brain. And what you'll notice and what you'll learn as a semester, as the course goes on, is that our brain actually works at the millisecond level. So capturing every 3 seconds is actually just an estimate of what's happening, not an exact understanding. Other systems in our body, like the cardiovascular system and the heart pumping, we can gather and we can collect data at a rate in which it is more closely functioning, meaning we have a better idea of how that organ actually functions. That's part of our issue with understanding brain behavior in in mental health conditions, is that we just don't have the technology yet to fully capture what's going on, and why we kind of have this black box attitude towards it. But in reality, the brain is just another organ in the human body. It's made up of cells, which are then made up, combine and create tissue. But it has a very specific purpose. The brain is responsible for controlling much of the rest of the body through direct communication, through nerves, or through indirect communication via hormones or other chemical messengers that it releases into the bloodstream or into other areas in the brain or other areas in the body. So this is our current issue in society, is that we don't understand this brain very well. When you think about it in relative to how we understand how the heart contracts, how our stomach digests, how our bladder releases urine, how muscles in our legs contract, how they heal. And that's part of our issue. This course is starting to unpack that and helping people hopefully understand it, what we do know, and then also where our limitations of knowledge are. Looking at the gross anatomy of the nervous system, and we'll repeat this when we talk about the neuroanatomy, but the nervous system is broken down into 2 primary areas: central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central is the brain and spinal cord, and then everything else you can think about is the peripheral nervous system. Behavior, what is it? When you're thinking about a definition, what is it actually? How do we derive? How do we indicate? How do we know what a behavior is? In a very psychological standpoint, it is a behavior is something that occurs over time. The pattern exists. It can be an innate behavior, meaning that it is ingrained, almost reflex, or it can be a learned behavior. And that's where a lot of human behavior, once you get out of the infant stage, becomes behaviors that are learned. And and then how you unlearn them, the ones that are maladaptive, versus reinforcing the ones that are adaptive. Over time, there have been approaches to how the mind and the body interact, or how the mind and the body create behavior. You go all the way back to Aristotle's time. The philosophy that was supported at that time, primarily by Aristotle, was that the idea that the mind was responsible for behavior. We coined this, or called this, mentalism, meaning that the mind, part of the mental capacity, was responsible for driving behavior. And then came along Descartes, who basically in his philosophical belief set, believed that the mind and the brain were two separate entities, and that it was where the mind and the brain kind of intersected. The mind was this other material, like the soul or spiritual or something that wasn't as tangible. That's what the mind was. And then the brain was this kind of physical, concrete matter, which between the two of them and the interactions that occurred, that was what drove behavior. This was point dualism because there are two different opposing ideas or different types of matter. And then as people continue to do research and people continue to observe things, and the philosophy started to change, in that it primarily stemmed from work that Charles Darwin did, where he started to notice in his travels across different continents that there were similar species of birds. Primarily that's where he started, was with birds, and then he looked at other mammals. He started to notice that there were similarities, yet there were differences. And this is what drove his idea that the species started to adapt to their environment, meaning that the ones who were successful at mating and passing on their genes were the ones that created this new, what looked like different species of birds or animals. And this was called natural selection. Thus, the ones that had the genes that supported the successful survival of that environment, whether it was to blend in better, to get away from prey more quickly, whatever that piece of natural selection was, the emphasis in Darwin's work is that individuals of a species that survive and reproduce and create the next offspring and protect them and give them the skill set to survive and then reproduce, those are the ones whose genes are passed on, and that creates a shift in that species that is being supported based on the environment. And that's pretty much where we're at today, is in this state of materialism, that the mind and the body are of the same material, and that our behavior is the creation of our brain synapses interacting with each other, which is what produces the behavior. And now that there's this other spiritualness, maybe piece that Descartes really felt was part of his theory about brain and behavior, that there were two different entities or two different matters. The view today is that there's something about the way that neurons interact that provide a level of consciousness. And we need to introduce a little bit about genes and genetics and how that plays a role in behavior. And that primarily has to do with the fact that we see a lot of differences in behavior based on some genetic work looking at monozygotic twins versus dizygotic twins versus just traditional siblings, and looking at how different behaviors appear to be linked to genes and are passed on based on their genes. So just a quick genomic lecture. If you're have any biological background, this is going to be very relatively simplistic, or if you remember this from high school. But basically, every human cell has 46 total chromosomes, 23 from the maternal donor and 23 from the paternal donor, and those get combined together to create a complete set of chromosomes. They're numbered from 1 to 23. The 23rd is the set of chromosomes that drive sex of, as I note here, 1 through 22 are autosomal genes, where the 23rd are the sex chromosomes, play a major role, again, in our physical and behavioral sexual characteristics. So getting into a little bit more definitions, you guys can read these, but basically we have two sets, as I mentioned already. If they're the identical alleles, they're considered homozygous for that trait, or if they're different, we are considered heterozygous. And there are two primary ways in which genes are expressed. There's dominant, which is if you have the dominant allele, it will be expressed. And in the recessive state, you have to have two recessives or two non-dominant alleles for it to be expressed. Otherwise, the dominant will express over the recessive gene. And there are a lot of different and more complicated ways to look at this, and you don't need to know it for this course, so I'm not going to go heavily into it, but there are other ways in which it can be expressed. And if you want to talk more about this, we can set up a time to talk, or you can do reading in the textbook, which is a really good section on this. So when you look at this, this is trying to help you understand how recessive versus dominant genes are passed on. So Huntington's disease, which is over here on the right, Huntington's disease is a dominant allele, but just because it's dominant doesn't mean that the majority of people show it. When you look at Huntington's disease, not everybody has it. So that means that the recessive gene is actually the more likely to be expressed gene in the human population, which is good because Huntington's disease does not start to show up or express until people are past their reproductive years, which means they may choose or have children even without knowing if they are a carrier for Huntington's or have Huntington's. And this is something where genetic counseling can actually start playing a role, and it's you can make decisions, because if you have two people who are carriers, meaning that they will develop the disease, but may not develop until after they reproduce, the chances of their offspring having or expressing Huntington's is 75%. So there's really only a 25% chance that they won't. The children won't have it, or the offspring won't have it. And if you have just one person who's a carrier, then that's reduced to 50-50 toss-up. Looking over here at Tay-Sachs, it is a recessive gene. And basically you have to have two copies of the recessive gene for the disease to be expressed. So again, the only time you would actually get someone or have the offspring have Tay-Sachs is if two carriers, meaning they do not express it, they'll never express it. If they would happen to get married and reproduce together, or reproduce even before marriage, that their offspring, there's a 25% chance that they will have a child with that 50% chance of actually passing the recessive on, meaning that their children or offspring would be carriers for it, and a 25% chance that the child or offspring would be normal. So this is how dominant versus recessive genes work. Epigenetics is an area that has really taken off and really developed over the last 10, maybe 15 years, and that they are really starting to tease apart when a cell either silences a gene or actually expresses the gene. And this is not a mutation, it's not altering the DNA sequence, it's just turning on and off genes. And it's been really interesting. This is something that is a very natural part of development, and we'll talk about it when we talk about development of the nervous system, and we talk a little bit about in utero development. It's a very natural phenomenon that we were exposed to, or that we understood. But what we've seen now is that epigenetics actually plays a role in behaviors, and that behaviors can change your epigenetic genetic distribution. And that was earth-shattering. Again, to find out that a behavior or psychology or things outside of the realm of genetics could actually influence the way genetic material functioned. And a lot of this was reinforced or discovered through studies looking at monozygotic versus fraternal or dizygotic twins. So monozygotic are two individuals who were, for some reason, in the early stages of development, after the egg and the sperm united, to create a fertilized egg, the egg or growing embryo split into two separate, where then it created two completely carbon copies, basically, individuals where the genes are exactly the same. Now, fraternal twins, or dizygotic twins, they are individuals who, for whatever reason, the female's body released two viable eggs, and both were fertilized and implanted and survived. So So the genetic material is no more similar than two siblings would be. But what's unique about dizygotic twins is that the in utero environment is also the same. The mother's the same age, the food she eats, the stress she experiences are all the same. And that's why dizygotic twins are unique when we're talking about outcomes with regard to genetics and behavior. They have different DNA, but they have the same environment, where you have just regular siblings who were born at least 9 months apart at a minimum. They don't have the same genes, nor do they have the same environment in which they were growing in. Really cool video to watch, and you should go watch it now.
Even before they're born, identical twins intrigue us. Scientists still don't understand why a single fertilized egg splits in the womb, creating two genetically identical people. But despite how little we know about them, twins have a lot to reveal about us.
Twin studies give us new ways of understanding human behavioral phenomena. The biological and environmental components of disease, of intelligence, of personality. The list is limitless.
For more than 30 years, Dr. Nancy Siegel has been studying reunited twins.
Dr. Siegel?
Yes.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Linda. So nice to meet you.
Same here.
It's a passion that's personal. Nancy is a twin herself.
Nice to meet you.
Today, she's meeting Linda and Doreen, twins reunited after 35 years apart.
The reason why we want to study twins raised apart is you help us solve questions such as, is the behavior more influenced by nature? Is it influenced more by nurture? You share all your genes in common, and yet they're raised in totally different environments. If we see similarities between you, then we know that these kinds of traits are strongly influenced by the genes.
Nancy recruits me as her research assistant, and through a series of questions, we examine how Doreen and Linda are different and similar. Do you have any phobias?
Yeah, I have a fear of heights. Scared to death of heights.
What is your favorite color?
Darker green, darker blues.
How often do you drink alcohol?
Very, very little. Never.
Do you have a favorite smell?
Florals, smells, perfumes.
The questions might seem elementary,
Nice and tall.
but the answers have fascinated scientists for decades.
I have you at 62 1/4 inches,
Okay.
which is exactly what I got for your sister.
Despite being raised apart, separated twins are often closely aligned, suggesting genes play a major role in who we are.
Try it the other way and tell me how it feels.
Right.
And Linda and Doreen are a perfect case study.
So you'd hold the nail with the left hand.
Living with her biological mother in a supportive household, Linda was encouraged to get an education, while Doreen was raised by her abductor and an alcoholic stepfather. By 17, she was pregnant. She never finished high school. Yet despite their different upbringings and not knowing each other for most of their lives, Linda and Doreen's bond was instant and intense.
When you met Linda for the first time, did she seem familiar?
It was almost like I knew what she was thinking. More familiar than a best friend. When I look at her or when I speak to her, I hear myself. Even though we're separate people, the more we spoke, the more it was like I knew her life. Like she had never been gone.
I think on average there is no closer bond than identical twins.
Why is that?
It's the perception of similarities that triggers an attraction and a liking between people. And the identical twins feel this immediately.
All right, you pick a color because I want to see what it looks like on me.
This is the potential for really sharing everything with somebody, of thinking so much alike. This intimacy and acceptance, it's irresistible.
Oh,
I figured.
ooh, I like that.
It's a fascinating theory about human behavior. We like what is like us, and no two people are more alike than identical twins.
I really like, oh, I like that one.
But growing up apart has given Linda and Doreen a double perspective on their relationship, both inseparable and individual.
We may be genetically the same, but I have my own likes and dislikes. I know she does, and we're happy that way.
What do you think would have happened if you hadn't been separated?
You kind of have to just let that go. You have to, because if you let, it'll eat you up. I don't need to look back and think of all the negative things that happened.
Thanks, Mom.
No regrets.
No regrets.
All right, so the evolution of the nervous system, and we see this across multiple species, and we still see species today that are considered the lower life forms. Initially, a neuron and a muscle cell had to be created. This is how we create locomotion. This is how we can start to see behavior. So really simple life forms. Then they moved into creating a nerve net, which means that there's more than one neuron and they communicate to each other. Then a bilateral symmetry developed. Like a worm is one of those examples. It's bilateral. There are symmetry, the same carbon copy on either half of the worm. Humans have this as well. All mammals do. There's also segmentation, meaning that the spinal cord has differing levels that correspond to different areas of the body. Then there are the development of ganglia, which are dense nuclei of multiple nervous neurons that speed up communication. Then there's the development of spinal cord and the brain. So that's the evolution of the nervous system. So very simple life forms have just neurons and muscle cells, where then each step is a more complicated layer of the development of the nervous system. Because we can see this transition across time with regards to the nervous system, all animals, once they get up to the chordate, which would be having spinal cord and brain, once we get there, so all mammals, even if we go back to fish, current with evolutionary theory is that there was a common ancestor all the way back to that single-celled organism. And just to drive home, it is a misnomer that we are descended from apes. In reality, humans and current-day apes were all related to a common ancestor. So chordates, I mentioned, I just want to let you know what it means. It means animals with spinal cord and brain. You might be wondering, how are humans segmented? And I just like to share this with you so that you can understand what we mean by differing levels of the nervous system correlating to different areas of the body. And this is what we're talking about. Up in the top, we have the cervical spine, which has branching off of that, which changes or influences different parts of our muscles and receives information from different areas. Then you have the thoracic area, the lumbar area, and the sacral area. And each one of these is considered a segment. If you have damage at this level, it will only affect here, it won't affect above or below, that kind of thing. Our understanding with regards to behavior is that as our nervous system became more complex, then our behaviors could become more complex. Thinking about fish to frog to bird to human. So fish are relatively simplistic in that they swim, that's their only locomotion, and then you move into frogs, which added in being able to survive on water and land and jumping. Again, stronger, more complex behaviors. Then you get the birds who can fly as well as walk, possibly float, kind of swimming, depending on the type of bird. Again, increasing its complexity. Being able to fly and defy gravity is much different than swimming in the water. And then you have the human brain, which we believe is the most complex, creation of behaviors. We have mastered the use of tools so that we can fly like birds, or we can swim under the water like fish do, right? So we master a lot of things, and we believe a lot of this has to do with the ability of our brains. When we look at evolution over time, considering we all come from a common ancestor, as locomotion became more complex, we needed multiple limbs to enhance our abilities and those types of things. Each one of those stages created greater complexity that had to be present prior to developing the behavior. The brain or the nervous system had to be able to do it before we could do it. When we think about human or primate lifestyle and why did our brain become so large, and if you look back at those photos, you can see fish versus frog versus bird, and then the human. I mean, our brains are massive compared to most other mammals and other chordates. One of the things that we believe played a major role in this was the transition of our food from being just vegetable, like grasses near the ground, to actually starting to forage and eat fruit, picking off berries from bushes and fruit up in trees. One of the things we can see across multiple different types of species is that the species or the animals that choose to eat fruit or have fruit in their diets typically have larger brains. This is true about primates. Almost all primates eat some form of fruit. Fruit is a high sugar food, giving the body and the brain more energy. This is believed to be the increased ability, or the ability of our brain to increase its production or complex thinking, because we added in this fruit. This is true about all non-human primates. Another interesting theory that is brought up in the textbook, and something to think about as it's one of the CTAs, critical thinking assignments, is that drastic climate changes resulted in the appearance of new species, especially when we're talking about primates. And it kind of makes sense. If your environment dramatically changes, there are going to be individuals within that species who are better able to adapt to either the hotter temperatures, colder temperatures, or have the ability to develop clothing if they need them, or have the ability to navigate at times when it's cooler, so better night vision. These are all kinds of things that forced changes in behaviors, or allowed different species to develop. Changes in climate could possibly be driving or changing the way evolution occurs. What does that say about what we do today? Especially in first world countries, what does that say about what we do? If climate's such a major factor in evolution, do we allow, are we controlled or driven by our climate anymore? Plant that seed and leave it grow. Here are some basic premise or points or perspectives that I need you all to gather an understanding around. And part of that's because these are the basics in which we're building a lot of the theory off in this class, and I need you to be able to appreciate it. Because animal species are related, know that their brains are related, and this allows us to study other species to understand our own behavior. So if all animal species are related and their brains are related, because all animals are related, our behavior must be related, then we can study other species' behavior and brain function and compare it to human behavior and help us draw conclusions about human behavior. That's why we do animal work. I mean, in all honesty, the majority of animal work is not spent on testing firms, testing cosmetics. It's really about testing human, animal behavior, and or possibly toxicity to drugs like chemotherapies, or drugs that save lives with regard to blood pressure or type 2 diabetes and managing your insulin levels. That's where a lot of animals are used for research purposes. So then this begs a question that we need to think about and we need to be thoughtful about. What types of behavior is considered human? What types of behavior is considered to be subhuman or not human or animalistic, not that humans are above? I'd like you to take time to go watch these two videos, because it may challenge the thoughts you just had about those two questions.
What we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side, and if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. If you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. What we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side, and if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. If you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task, and we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us, and that's what she does. And she gets a grape, And see, each of the other one sees that. C gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests a rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here. Let me tell you, I still have 2 minutes left. Let me tell you a funny story about this. This study became very famous, and we got a lot of comments, especially anthropologists, economists, philosophers. They didn't like this at all because they had decided in their mind, I believe, that fairness is a very complex issue and that animals cannot have it. And so one philosopher even wrote us that it was impossible that monkeys had a sense of fairness because fairness was invented during the French Revolution. So now, and another one wrote a whole chapter saying that he would believe it had something to do with fairness if the one who got grapes would refuse the grapes. Now, the funny thing is that Sarah Brosnan, who's been doing this with chimpanzees, had a couple of combinations of chimpanzees where indeed the one who would get the grape would refuse the grape until the other guy also got a grape. So we're getting very close to the human sense of fairness, and I think philosophers need to rethink their philosophy for a while. So let me summarize. I believe there's an evolved morality. I think morality is much more than what I've been talking about, but it would be impossible without these ingredients that we find in other primates, which are empathy and consolation, pro-social tendencies, and reciprocity and a sense of fairness. And so we work on these particular issues to see if we can create a morality from the bottom up, so to speak, without necessarily God and religion involved, and to see how we can get to an evolved morality. And I thank you for your attention.
Oh, this is the part where he's going off to school.
Who say that? Shakespeare, King Henry, remember? Before the battle.
Did he say you, huh?
No. He didn't. You're quite right. He said English when he was talking about people who are brave, like him. Want to say that?
15 has been cleaned and just needs to be cross-checked.
Well, then, or yesterday we got a lot of...
Can you say acknowledge? Huh? Coco's turning her back. This is a sad scene where Luca goes away and they all kiss him and kiss him goodbye. Oh, honey, it is kind of a sad scene. Let me sing a song about courage. Or recite a poem about courage. There they are kissing him goodbye. Multiple kisses. Okay.
And gentlemen in England, now
They have courage, honey. Do you have courage? You have courage. You look very courageous. Good. Is there something I can do for you? Oh, honey, it's sad. I know it's a sad scene. Oh, they're crying. They are crying on the movie. Oh, honey. And there's trouble, sad trouble, bad. Oh, sweetie, with the mother, yes, the sweet mother, the one who adopted him. She's so sweet. Well, I know, it's hard to watch that, so you didn't want to.
Finish up here. I want you to think about one last important thing, and this has to do with the CTA as well, is the role of culture in society. Now, this class is about brain and behavior. But you can't leave a psychology class without having some type of context being placed. Culture is filled with a series of learned behaviors that are passed on from one generation to the next. And each generation will have new experiences and value new and different skills. But there's still some threads of very early human behavior that's being passed down. Today, we have dramatically changed the way we interact with the environment. And I think we're seeing the changes that are challenging us. For example, our brains did not evolve to be interacting with and constantly being stimulated by electronics. What does that mean, or what is that doing or changing for the way in which our brains function? If we weren't designed to do it, could a lot of our mental health issues possibly be falling out from this greater exposure to computers and cell phones and always being plugged in? Possibility. It's something that's not able to be answered with data at this point, but maybe someday. But the other thing I want to drive home is that the brain is highly flexible. So our brains were not evolved for the world that we're actually engaged in and living in. Yet we're still able, most of us, many of us, are still able to successfully navigate the world, interact with all the different pieces, and continue to advance. So I want you to think about that when you're thinking, if you do prompt 1 for RC, right? That's the end of what I wanted to talk about for introduction to origins of our behavior.